The Analog 4 is very different from other synths. The way it controls sequences and creates analog sounds is very unique. In this clip, I'll cover 10 things that make it stand out, as well as almost all aspects of its sound design capabilities. We have a lot to cover, so I'll get right to it. This is the first trick it has up its sleeve. This kick, and now this snare. You see, every one of the 4 voices can, on each step of the sequence, change to something completely different. You can also change parameters on a per step basis. For example, I added reverb now, but only to step 9 in the sequence. So this functionality of changing the entire sound is called sound locks, and when you apply individual parameters, it's called parameter locks, and you can apply it to each and every one of the individual steps in a sequence. The second trick or unique feature is the ability to, while having each track have its own unique sound, share voices amongst tracks if you want to play polyphonically, and do this on the fly. So in this kit or group of sounds, I have this on track 2, this on track 3, this on track 4, and this sound on track 1, which as you see by default won't play polyphonically, but if I go to polyconfig and add voice sharing, then I can steal notes from other tracks and play polyphonically. All of this is done dynamically, and I can always get my voices back when I need them. The third unique thing is its wave shaping capabilities. So it's got the standard waveforms, a triangle waveform, pulse, transistor pulse, which is a combination of pulse and saw, and then saw. However, where it gets interesting is that you can change the pulse width or the wave shape of all the wave shapes. Triangle, for example, or the transistor pulse, pulse width of the pulse wave, of course, and the triangle, which turns into a saw eventually. Each voice has 2 oscillators, and each of the oscillators has right there in the main menu a modulation control for the pulse width or wave shape. So you can change the speed and the depth of the modulation without having to go and connect an LFO. It's just right there, very convenient, and makes the sound immediately much more dynamic. And remember, modulation can be applied to all waveforms, not just pulse. You can get interesting effects by changing the center point of the modulation. And in terms of speed, you can go extremely high. Very effective and interesting tone control, especially for bass sounds. The next wave shaping tool in our arsenal is Amplitude Modulation, and for that I'm going to lower oscillator 2. So we're only hearing oscillator 1 now, and if I go to page 2, the green page of oscillator 2, and turn on Amplitude Modulation, well, check out the sounds and waveforms. So all kinds of craziness can ensue from that. You can also force the oscillators to sync to each other, and that also produces very interesting waveforms and sounds, of course. There are a few sync modes, and the idea here is that rather than each of the oscillators just doing their own thing, when I increase the volume of oscillator 2, you'll hear how they start to affect each other. The final way to change waveforms is using an LFO to get frequency modulation. And you can modulate a number of things, the pitch, the filter, but we'll go with pitch here. So I've set the target of the LFO to be the pitch of oscillator 1, and I can change the multiples to the tuning fork, which means that the LFO speed is tied to a multiple of oscillator 1. And FM synthesis is basically just vibrato at high speeds. If you look at the spectrograph, you'll see as I go higher in frequency, more harmonics show up. And the waveform kind of turns funky and sounds what is characteristic of FM synthesis. Next standout is sub-oscillators, where you get not just one octave, but also two, both of them, or a fifth. And that's just on one oscillator. So if I bring in oscillator 2 and tune that, I can get a major chord or a minor chord. So having two oscillators with this flexibility and with the sub-oscillators is a nice way to get more out of your voices. Because you only have 4 voices, but you can get full chords, and if I add a fifth to my second oscillator, and now we have 4 notes on just one of the 4 voices of the Analog 4. Okay, filters. The next thing that makes the Analog 4 stand out is the amount and quality of filters it has. This first filter, the line on top, is a 4-pole or 24 dB per octave low-pass filter, which means that it lets everything under the cutoff point pass, and everything above is quickly reduced at 24 dB per octave. You can plug the output of this filter into oscillator 1 as feedback if you want. And it has really nice overdrive. Turn it to the right or left. It has a different character depending on where you position it. It's obviously beyond the scope of this short tutorial to demo it on multiple types of sounds, but it works really nicely as you feed different things into it. The bottom row represents the second filter, which is a multimode filter. Now, let me show you how you can use that. For example, I'm putting it in high-pass mode and increasing the resonance to give the bottom end of my sound a boost. And if I activate tracking, then the cutoff point of the filter will follow the pitch of the notes as I play along. And I'll do that for both filters. So now that we have filter pitch tracking, if I take my high-pass filter and find just the right spot, it will track the notes as I play them. So most synths only have one filter, and having two just gives you that much more sound design capabilities. To show you visually what the multimode filter does, I will activate the noise oscillator on page 2 of oscillator 1. And by the way, even the noise here isn't standard. There's different sample and hold rates for it, and it actually has its own filters, both high pass and low pass, 6 dB per octave, so gentle slope. Anyway, let me go back to the filters. So filter 1, the 24 dB per octave filter, here you can see visually both the sharp slope and what happens when I activate resonance. And to have on top of that filter number 2, which is also resonant, could make things very interesting. This is what the high-pass filtering looks like with resonance. This filter has 2 slope modes, both for the high-pass filter and its low-pass filter. There's a 6 dB per octave, which is a gentle slope or a sharper slope. It also has a band stop mode, which, without resonance, of course, because that wouldn't make sense, cuts out or carves out frequencies. In peak mode, the filter will emphasize frequencies at the cutoff point without cutting off the others above it or below it. And finally, bandpass will let a narrow band through and cut the rest out, very gently though. Envelopes is another place where the Analog 4 outdoes many other synths. Let's start with the amp envelope on the amp page. It starts out pretty much standard, what you'd expect from an amp envelope, with attack, speed, sustain level, decay, the time that it takes the sound to reach from its peak point to the sustain level, and release, which is the time that it takes the sound to die down to nothing. Where the Analog 4 starts being non-standard is with its envelope shape controls. So that little dot that appears next to the waveform determines if the envelope is reset every time you trigger a note. And if the envelope lines are curvy or straight, that determines if the slopes are linear or exponential, either going up or down or both. And this odd shape makes the attack start at maximum every time and have a definite attack time regardless of how long a note is pressed. So that's the amp envelope, but there are way more. I'll hit the envelopes button and reach the envelopes page. The first is the filter envelope, which can be, using these buttons, used to modulate other things as well, but let's start with the filter. So initially, if I change the envelope parameters, it won't affect the filter because it doesn't know which filter to affect. I need to go to the filters page and choose the depth and direction of the movement of the filter frequency. So it's a little bit hard to grasp initially how envelopes work, but basically it's the control of a knob, a one-time control of a knob. Attack controls the speed of the movement in one direction, decay controls the speed of the movement back, and the sustain level controls how far the motion goes. And even though it's called the filter envelope, it can be applied to two other destinations as well. Let's check out envelope 2. That could have its own separate shape settings and be applied to two destinations as well. So I'm going to look for my oscillator 1 pitch and apply it to that. So this works the same way. Attack is the speed of a motion, and you can use sustain or the modulation depth to determine how far it'll go and the direction as well. Next up on the modulation menu are Lfos. Select the destination and Lfos will wiggle them around any way you like. You can choose the depth, it's bipolar, so the direction, the speed in various multiples. What's unique here is just the sheer amount of Lfos. There are 2 per voice with 2 destinations for each. And remember, each voice can have completely independent Lfos and a very broad range of destinations for each of them. Lfos also have waveforms, and they determine the character of the motion. Randomness is encouraged. But wait, there's more. The next thing that I think is really unique about the Analog 4 sound design is the fact that they've sprinkled across the interface multiple additional Lfos and envelopes. So for example, here in the oscillator menu, and I showed you this before, the pulse width can be modulated right there on the spot. You don't need to patch an LFO, there are full controls for it. Same goes for vibrato. It has its own direct LFO controls directly in the interface, so you don't need to bother with patching an LFO or waste it just to get vibrato. The vibrato fade is another good example. You've got controls right here, no need to waste an envelope or take time patching it. And there are many, many more of these envelopes and LFOs just waiting to be found. So for example, the bend parameter is a pitch envelope directly pre-patched. So again, you don't need to spend, quote unquote, an envelope to get that done. So there are quite a few of those. Let me show you one more. The noise oscillator also has its own envelope. So you can create percussive sounds very easily And this is really nice for layering a percussive sound on your synth. And because the envelopes aren't tied to each other, you can have a short breath-like hit and then let your sound play out. The next sound design feature that makes the Analog 4 special is, or are, its onboard effects. So the amp menu for every voice has different send settings for chorus, delay, and reverb. These sends go to a separate effects track, which lets you configure the effect parameters in more detail. So I'll select delay and then click effects. Now each of these buttons controls something different as per the label underneath it. So I'll play with delay timing, for example. Or feedback. Careful not to go over 100. At least not for long. And there are such pages for each of the effects. Let's look at reverb for a second. I'll hit effects and then reverb control. Pre-delay. And room size or depth. And you get the idea. So what if I wanted to modulate this? Let's say this motion. It's not natural, but let's do it anyway, because the effects track has its own Lfos. So let's take this parameter, the pre-delay parameter. Let me find it. As you can see, you can control all the parameters from all the effects, but I want to choose reverb pre-delay. And I need to choose a modulation amount. And there we go. Now that motion is automatically modulated. So that's it for automatic modulations. Now, what if I wanted more manual control? What if I wanted one knob to control more than one thing? That's where performance mode comes in, where the 10 knobs can be configured to control each up to 5 parameters. I'll choose knob A, and here is where you define which parameters it controls on which track and to what extent. So what I'm going to do is take the pitch of oscillator 1 and have one knob turn move it up, let's say by this amount. And the second parameter I want to control with the same knob is the pitch of oscillator 2. So let me select that, but I want it to go in the opposite direction. So 2 parameter changes, 2 knob turns basically, but with the turn of one knob, knob A. And you can give these knobs names so that you remember what each one of them does. You can take expressive control to another level if you connect an external keyboard or other MIDI, or in the Mark II Analog 4, other CV devices or pedals to your Analog 4. So there are a few modulations like aftertouch that are configured by default. The sound menu gives you quick access to the different modulation configurations, velocity, pitch bend, modulation, breath controller if you have one, and aftertouch. So in this case, let's change how aftertouch is configured. It already controls vibrato. And let's say that I want to add a filter modulation to it. Now, if I'm modulating plus or up, I need to make sure that my filter frequency's starting point is low so that it can go up and that we can hear it. So something like this. And you can change up to 5 parameters this way. And let's go, say, for example, choose something else that we want to use to modulate. Let's choose the modulation wheel, which on the key step is the strip, is the modulation strip. And for simplicity's sake, we can have that affect the filter frequency as well. So that's it in terms of Analog 4 sound design. There are obviously plenty of features that I didn't cover that aren't directly related to sound design, like sequencing, MIDI map, which I already did a tutorial about. Check it out, a really special and unique feature that allows you to control different voices with one keyboard. also check out my 5-year review of the original Mark I Analog 4, which also includes a comparison to this Mark II Analog 4, as well as covering other cool stuff like conditional trigs. Hit like if this was useful for you. Click subscribe if you want to see more. There's going to be more stuff about the Analog 4 coming. Thanks very much for watching.